I've discussed a lot of UTDR content on this channel recently, and unsurprisingly, those videos have been quite popular. Yet, despite how much derivative content has been made based on Undertale and Deltarune, there's still so much more to be explored. One topic I think could do with some more exploration is the use of archetypes, especially in Undertale, which more or less follows the template of an albeit slightly modified folk adventure or fable. More about that later. Now, if you don't know what archetypes are a concept first introduced by the renowned psychologist Carl Gustav Jung in the early 20th century, and although it's actually quite a nuanced idea, for the purposes of this video, you can think about them as certain underlying patterns found almost universally in almost all the best stories, plots, and especially characters, which tend to repeat themselves throughout history in different forms, shapes, and sizes. They're the basic templates followed by the most memorable and typical characters, storylines, and structures in fiction. A classic example of an archetype is the wise old man, a character often found in classical adventure stories who aids the protagonist and helps them develop and mature into a true hero. Think about Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, or Obi-Wan or Yoda in the original Star Wars trilogy, for example. But anyway, back to Undertale. Think about Asgore, Toriel, Undyne, Sans, and Papyrus. These are all incredibly interesting characters if we think about them as people, but that's already been explored by a lot of people before me. What I want to ask is, can we understand these familiar characters on a more symbolic level? Do they have something in common with classic archetypes like the hero, the old wise man, or the trickster? That's the question I want to explore today. Now, there will be no summary of the game in this video, so if you're not familiar with the story of Undertale, go play it, or at least watch a story summary, or you can just keep watching without understanding anything, I guess. I think the most natural character to start with in a video like this is actually Asgore, the conflicted and surprisingly kind-hearted king of the underground. Symbolically, Asgore isn't just the king of the underground, he also seems to represent the king of the underworld, very similarly to Osiris in Egyptian mythology. He's initially presented as a kind of villain, someone ominous we'll have to face at the end of our journey if we wish to return to the surface, but over the course of the story we learn that he isn't truly evil in any way, just misguided. Like he says at the end of his boss battle, if we spare him.
I just want to see my wife. I just want to see my child.
Despite his ultimately good intentions though, for most of the game, when you first play it anyway, Asgore feels like a big baddie, someone who represents everything we don't as the protagonist. Another really significant detail about Asgore is that he wants to collect 7 human souls, so that he can break the barrier and ascend to the surface to start a war with humanity and avenge the murder of his son Azrael. See, a common variation of the king archetype is the king who has lost his way, so to speak. What does that mean? Well, often in stories, the king is old and represents the established order, the status quo. In these situations, the role of the hero is usually to either defeat the old king or else to show him that he has to accept the need for an upheaval of the old order that he's so attached to, so that change and evolution can be brought about. The hero arrives because things have become stuck in the past in an unhealthy way, and an external force is needed to push them forwards. Very interestingly, this becoming stuck in the past also correlates symbolically with Azrael's death.
I remember the day after my son died. The entire underground was devoid of hope. The future had once again been taken from us by the humans. In a fit of anger, I declared war. I said that I would destroy any human that came here.
Isn't there something really mythical about this story? The tragic king who promises to kill all humans who enter his kingdom after the death of his son? As the son of the king and queen, Asriel, along with Kara, represented the future of the underground. Not only that, but with Kara in the picture, they could even represent a reunion of the surface and underground. Correspondingly, things don't actually progress anywhere after his and Kara's deaths. Instead, things become stuck in place, Asgore taking on an attitude of hostility towards the surface, just as the surface originally took on an attitude of hostility towards him by locking the monsters in the underground. I therefore believe the best archetype for Asgore, beyond just being a generic king figure, is the king of the underworld. He's the king of the underworld not just because he's in the underground, although that's an important part of it, but also because he's been neglected. Unlike things on the surface, which progress ever onwards, Asgore and his kingdom have become stuck in a state of stagnation. There are some really interesting ways to interpret this psychologically, specifically in terms of the dynamics between consciousness and the unconscious, but before we get to that, let's look at the other characters first. Since Asgore both is a king and represents a kind of king archetype, it should be obvious that Toriel, at least originally, is the queen. Toriel is the mother figure of Undertale, taking on the role of caretaker for Frisk when they initially tumble down into the ruins. She's kind and generous, but also rather overprotective. It's clear that her greatest strengths lie in protecting and providing for others, but at the same time she can be very controlling, falling victim to her own fears and worries. I don't want to dwell too long on Toriel, but before moving on, it's worth noting her relationship to Asgore. Obviously, when we look at the two of them together, it's easy to see that besides being a king, Asgore is also obviously a father figure. Toriel and Asgore are the symbolic parents of the underground, just as Asriel is the symbolic child. The incredible importance of these characters for the underground as a whole is seen in the unforgettable segment New Home, where all the different monsters we've encountered throughout the game recount the story of how Kara fell at Mount Ebott and befriended Asriel, their friendship eventually leading to the tragic death of both. The way this is presented, all the monsters speaking as one, demonstrates that Asriel and Kara weren't just the children of Asgore and Toriel. They were the hope of the entire underground, just as Asgore is essentially the father of the underground and Toriel the mother. The underground, unlike the real world, isn't a disparate crowd of people who are only vaguely connected to one another. They're one big family. This is another detail Undertale has in common with a lot of folk adventures and other myths. Unlike our reality, where everyday occurrences and world events can often seem random and circumstantial, in myths and fables, on the other hand, everything is deeply interconnected, and each event serves a specific symbolic role in the overarching context of the world. That's why I think it's so worthwhile to make a video like this. Now we get to Undyne, another character who plays a very clear and distinct role in the game. If Asgore is the king, then who else is Undyne but the knight? She's the one who acts on the king's behalf, aligned with him, and therefore also with the established order, if you remember what I said about Asgore. Until she's befriended by Frisk, you could basically describe Undyne as the knight of the status quo, resolute in her fixed beliefs that humans are evil and must be destroyed to bring freedom to the monsters. In this way, during the first part of the game when she's hostile to us, she's essentially like any henchman of the evil king who you have to overcome before getting to the end goal. She's then essentially just a representation of Asgore's own resistance to change, his own resistance to moving on from Asriel's death, a servant of the old king in dire need of reform. The relevance of the knight archetype is also reinforced when you think about who the knight's mortal enemy is: the dragon. Just as traditional knights go on quests to slay the evil dragon who threatens the realm, Undyne is on a quest to capture and kill the humans that fall into the underground, who she views as the ultimate threat to her realm. In this context, The dragon is the representation of uncompromising evil, a force which does nothing but serve its own greed and destroy everything in its way. But although humanity in Undertale admittedly does have some of these traits, having imprisoned the monsters in the underground and all, the initial demonization of humanity which Undyne displays yet again goes to show that the underground's overall state and view of humanity is incomplete. The status quo in the underground has grown imbalanced and toxic, unable to overcome the echoes of past tragedies, and therefore unable to progress. And if the original Undyne was more of a negative manifestation of the night, then Undyne, after we befriended her, represents the night at its best. Someone who unrelentingly fights, not just to destroy an ill-thought-out enemy, but to protect and defend values actually worth defending. Not just out of hatred for all humans, but in the hope of a better future where monsters and humans can be reconciled. Now we get to a pair of characters which might strike you as less obvious for a video like this. Namely, Sans and Papyrus, the perfectly complementary, meme-generating skeletal brothers of the underground who we get to know so well. While I don't think Sans and Papyrus individually represent two different archetypes, I think if we look at the different traits the two of them have, and the way they complement each other so perfectly throughout the game, an interesting pattern shows up. Let's look at each of their traits and consider whether we can correlate them with any particular archetype. Starting with Papyrus, on the one hand, he's first of all an adorable character. Clumsy and naive to the extreme, yet at the same time incredibly endearing and wholesome. At the beginning of the game, he insists on making the player participate in a series of puzzles, each of which is either comically easy or silly, like solving a word scramble, or else it fails in some anticlimactic manner, like the colored square puzzle. And as the game continues, his antics only grow sillier. I hope you'll forgive me, but when it comes to archetypes, there's one character in particular he always sort of reminded me of, namely Jar Jar Binks from Star Wars.
Surprised?
Although there are some important differences between them, and Papyrus is all round a much more beloved character than Jar Jar, they've still got a lot in common. Like Jar Jar, Papyrus also has a certain simplicity, clumsiness, and almost impenetrable lack of realistic self-awareness. Yet it's precisely that which makes him so endearing. He's totally out of touch. And if only he was a bit more self-aware, you would call him arrogant, knowing some of the things he says. Now, the archetype I'm hinting at with this comparison is none other than the trickster. Those of you who know anything about this archetype may be a bit puzzled. After all, the trickster is traditionally seen as someone devious, perhaps someone manipulating a situation to their advantage, all whilst hiding their true colors. In this sense, I'd say Flowey is a more accurate representation of the trickster, and we'll talk about that later. But archetypes are complex, and there are actually several different variations of the trickster. Sometimes, the trickster manifests as a devious figure, but other times, not so much. See, another version of this archetype can also manifest as a character with a profound lack of self-awareness, who appears comedic because of the actions taken in that state of lacking self-awareness, and that's precisely what Papyrus does. Now, if we consider Sans in relationship to this, we start to see that a lot of the traits of the trickster which Papyrus lacks are exactly the traits Sans has. They're both similar in that they have a comedic edge, Sans constantly throwing bad jokes, yet while Papyrus is unaware of the deeper significance of things, Sans, despite appearing like a more or less straightforward character on first sight, is actually one of the characters with the most insight into the true nature of things. He walks in one direction mysteriously and appears magically on the opposite side. He seems to know things he really shouldn't, and as we learn in the genocide route, he's unbelievably powerful despite supposedly having 1 HP, 1 attack, and 1 defense. I think archetypally, we can think about Sans as that portion of the trickster which is missing from Papyrus. Archetypally, they're essentially one and the same, but they represent different components of the same idea. Papyrus isn't devious and has no hidden intentions, but with Sans on the other hand, it's not so clear. This two sides of the same coin relationship is also somewhat strengthened when you think about the fact that they're brothers and both skeletons. In essence, Papyrus is like the trickster because of his lack of self-awareness and clown-like traits, whereas Sans is like the trickster because he's hiding his true nature behind a facade of comedy. He's hiding his insight behind a veil of fart jokes and his extraordinary power behind false labels. In this way, they compensate each other, and if you were to merge them together, so to speak, you'd have a more or less complete trickster archetype. As a side note though, it's worth noting that, in a way, Papyrus also has a hidden wisdom. While he's very silly and naive on the outside, at the other side of that naivete is an inner strength and positive attitude which I'd say is one of the most impressive traits in any Undertale character. Tragically, the best example of this side of Papyrus shows up only during the genocide route, in his very last moments after the player has struck the fatal blow.
Well, that's not what I expected. But still, I believe in you. You can do a little better, even if you don't think so. I promise.
And before we move on, I'd also like to mention that you can argue there's more to Sans than just the trickster archetype. As we learn the hard way in Genocide, he's also a passer of judgment and a lotter of bad times, examining your actions and passing judgment upon you before you face Asgore, the king of the underworld. A commenter pointed out that there are some similarities between Sans and the Egyptian god Anubis. Anubis was said to weigh the hearts of the dead against a feather to determine whether they were worthy of entering into the underworld. And while Sans is a lot more generous in his judgment than that, there's a very interesting parallel between the two of them, especially when you consider that the underground corresponds to the underworld. And like I said, Asgore could very easily be said to correspond to Osiris, the Egyptian god of the underworld. To return briefly to the trickster, I mentioned earlier that the trickster is also often devious and cunning, with a penchant for manipulation and some less than honorable intentions, like the Joker from Batman. This isn't really seen in either Sans or Papyrus, but there is another character which fits that description quite well. That's right, I'm talking about everyone's favorite ejector of friendliness pellets, Flowey the Flower. While Sans and Papyrus represent the positive aspects of the trickster, Flowey all round represents the negative, devilish aspects. Like good old Lightbringer Lucifer himself, Flowey represents temptation. He's constantly trying to convince the player to subscribe to his twisted kill or be killed philosophy, initially hiding his true nature in a very trickster-like way, pretending to be your friend whilst intending to kill you. And just like Sans, he also has hidden powers which allow him to essentially break the laws of nature, a typical characteristic of the trickster. As another totally random side note, there are a lot of similarities between Undertale and the Nintendo game Super Paper Mario. One of them being that both games have a prominent trickster character who suddenly takes the stage at the end and obtains godlike powers. And there are a lot of other similarities too, so if anyone would like to see a video on that someday, let me know in the comments. But anyway, I think we've dwelled on this archetype long enough, so let's go on. Having discussed the archetypes of Undertale from the point of view of these most central characters, I think it's about time we looked in a little more depth at how this ties in with the story as a whole, as I promised. See, I think a great part of the reason why Undertale became so popular is, among other things, because it offers a unique twist on a certain kind of story we've seen many times in the past. It's the story of a main character from the surface, the upper world of supposed light or goodness, delving into the depths to face the monsters and demons of the underworld. We see the contrast between an overworld and an underground, a normal world and an other world. A hero who has to traverse the underworld and speak to its king in order to find a way out, hopefully saving the underworld from its predicament in the process. Namely, the predicament of having been neglected and rejected by the overworld, the surface world of humans. Not only is this a classic archetypal trope, but like I promised earlier, it can also actually be understood in psychological terms if you think about the surface as representing consciousness and the underground as representing the unconscious. Jungian Psychology 101 states that a big part of personal development is about integration of the unconscious parts of yourself, making the unconscious conscious so that you can better understand and accept yourself, including the parts of you which seem unacceptable. If we think about Undertale on these terms, then one way to frame the story is as a story of repression, a story of consciousness banishing parts of itself, which should rightfully be given their fair share, into the depths of the unconscious. The humans become a representation of the conscious mind, of the ego, and the monsters of the underground, like the fairies, spirits, and daimonic beings they essentially are, become symbols of the unconscious, repressed parts of your mind. The world of the monsters refuses to progress forwards, unlike the human world, as we see evidenced by their technology, just like how your own repressed feelings and thoughts become childlike and stuck in a mire of past trauma, never developing, never allowing you to become your best self. The humans attacked Asriel when he rose to the surface, just as we might attack our own unwelcome, repressed feelings when they veer their ugly faces. Brisk's archetypal role as the hero, then, becomes to reunite these two shards, these two pieces of one reality, and bring about a new synthesis, a complete and balanced world, or psychologically speaking, a balanced mind. Brisk becomes the mediator between the surface and the underground, a representative of both sides, being a human themselves, but at the same time having befriended the monsters. Asriel was the original hope of the underground. The friendship of Asriel and Kara, and eventual fusion of their souls after Kara's death, could be thought of as prefiguring Frisk's actual reunion of the surface and underground during the pacifist route. Symbolically, it was like a failed attempt, which has now finally been achieved in reality after the events of Pacifist. Relating this back to Asgore and the negative attitude of the underground at the beginning of the game, we can say that the true solution to your problem, like Asgore's desire to destroy the barrier, is never to use force to destroy the other side. Instead, the solution can always be found in the middle. It comes in an unexpected form. For example, in the form of a human falling into the underground who somehow manages to befriend all the monsters against all odds. A true hero who can heal old wounds and bring the shattered pieces back together, reviving the old king from his complacent state and helping each and every person become their best self. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe and leave your thoughts along with any ideas for future videos in the comments. I'd like to give a special thanks to Pensher for generously making the thumbnail for this video. If there are any YouTubers or up-and-coming YouTubers watching who need some help with that type of thing, be sure to click the link in the description. And while you're at it, check out my Substack. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.